Well, thank you very much for that. Good evening. I'm going to start with some background to the Reformation. Now, this is obviously Adam and Eve, and before the Reformation, sin is a central anxiety. Sin starts with Adam and Eve, the original sin, biting into the apple. I must say that it was developed, ideas about original sin were developed by St. Augustine. So when the new Pope was announced and it was the first Augustinian, I did a little gulp and thought, are we going to get a concern about sin? Well, let us see anyway. The central anxiety is about sin. It is for Protestants and it is for Catholics. Original sin, inherited from Adam and Eve. Now, Catholics believed in the concept of purgatory, and you can see here sinners roasting in purgatory, being purged of their sin. And everybody went to purgatory according to Catholic doctrine in the Middle Ages. Now, I'm stood here tonight, and this is sinful. This is a sin of pride. I can see that everything I do, the extra biscuit I had at lunchtime, the sin of greed, all these things have to be purged. Erasmus said at one stage that no man tells his wife that the dinner was lousy or that he looks a dog in that dress. Now, Erasmus, for a monk, knew a lot about married life, so we'll leave that to one side. But Erasmus is about kindliness. But he is discussing the difference between degrees of sin. To him, it's more kindly to say the meal was lovely and to tell a lie, but nevertheless, it is a lie. The meal was lousy. I've written reports that were very kindly, but they weren't true, because to write the truth would have been hurtful and damaging, but it's a sin. So, sins, you all would spend, according to Catholic doctrine, time in purgatory, but that time could be shortened. It could be shortened by masses to the dead. So your relatives, this is rather like a Ponzi scheme, I suppose. You say masses for granny in the hope that your grandchildren will say masses for you. You know, you've got to have people coming in at the bottom to get you through purgatory in the same way as you're trying to get others through purgatory. Masses for the dead, gifts to the church, and to the poor. That was credit. Good works are credit. Pilgrimages to shrines and of saints, that's a good thing. And paying to be buried in a particular place near to the altar, in the church, rather than the churchyard. We get the expression, the stinking rich, because the rich paid for themselves to be put under the floors of churches. And of course, we know what would happen to corpses. So masses were said in chantry chapels. This is an elaborate one that wasn't destroyed, not removed later on in Edward VI's reign. And Seymour had at least one, St Mary's Scarborough more than one, and York Minster had 60 of these, a great many. Now, if you can imagine, if you were at St Mary's Scarborough, you would have, and you had more than, say we had 2 chantries, then you'd have a vicar, call him a rector. You would then have 2 chantry priests, one for each, and each one would have a sexton, a chaplain. That's 5 religious for one parish. There's a great many more religious. 1 in 12 in York were religious at one stage. 1 man in 12. Quite extraordinary numbers. So that's a belief in what you do for the dead. Then there is transubstantiation. Now, there's many ways of interpreting what happens at Holy Communion or at the Mass, call it what you will. But according to Henry VIII, he actually believed in transubstantiation. It was one of his central beliefs. He never wavered from that, not even when he was influenced by Anne Boleyn or Thomas Cromwell. And he believed the wafer changed into the body of Jesus Christ. Literally. And many, many Catholics did. In a small city like York, people used to rush around from parish to parish, seeing the miracle of the Mass, seeing the wafer being lifted up, seeing it repeatedly. Now, when you get to Protestantism, and I would just ignore the brass cross in this illustration, because that's a modern addition. You can see 2 pulpits and box pews. And this is Holy Trinity Goodrham Gate, which is a classic relic of a Calvinist past, where you can see preaching is the most important thing, and you can see the fact that people didn't even face the altar, because these boxes, you've got seats on 4 sides. So you can imagine going to worship and not facing the altar. That's not what we're used to. Not even, I would suspect, in a Salvation Army hall. Discarded purgatory, reinterpreted transubstantiation, and really downplayed what they regarded as priestly magic. That's what Protestants do. And of course, when the Reformation comes, it isn't the cosy Church of England. It is very much, as we shall see, a Lutheran and Calvin-influenced form of worship. Holy Communion becomes a remembrance. There's a fight between 2 pieces of furniture, the pulpit and the altar. And in Protestant times, the pulpit wins, and in Catholic times, the altar wins. Now, Luther, humankind is far too sinful. No amount of good works or giving to the church will get you into heaven. You are so enamored with, filled with sin, there's no way you can pay for it all. Something else has got to get you into heaven. And that thing is faith alone. That's the key. It's not whether you're good or bad, but whether you believe. That's to Luther. And Calvin, it's grace. You're predestined. And people find themselves trying to prove that they are destined for heaven, not destined for hell. There's no purgatory. And that's Calvin. And he's very, very influential. Now, if that's the background, I'm now going to go on to Aslaby, the soldier. In the Middle Ages, the Aslabys came from Aslaby near Pickering. Francis was involved, that's James's father, in putting down the Seymour Rebellion of 1548, a rising that involved Seymour and all the parishes that ran down the northern escarpment of the Wolds. So if we have a look at the next one, sorry. When we go to this. So from Malton to Humberby, the Knaptons, Ganton, Scagglethorpe, Hesletons, all those places were up in revolt. 3,000 rebels. We should call it the Wintringham Revolt, but it's called the Seymour Revolt because a guy went into an ale house in Wintringham, a guy called Calvert, and he had a skinful, and he started to talk too loudly, and the authorities knew that the rebellion was going to start in Wintringham, so they moved the centre to Seymour instead of. But if you are, consider it, if you're going to revolt against a government, the element of surprise is what you want. Calvert has allowed the authorities, Holgate, the Lord President of the Council of the North, Archbishop Holgate, knows already that there is trouble brewing and knows already that they're going to change the centre. So you must have been very, very desperate to go up in revolt at that time, knowing very well the authorities already knew what you were up to. But they did. And there is a very nasty incident at Seymour where they take 4 out of their bedrooms, in 2 members of the gentry and 1 wife, and what's called a chantry commissioner. And they murder them, and they string them up and display them. It says on Seymour Moor, but usually with these things they need a bit of height. So if Seymour Parish stretches towards Staxton roundabout, you can imagine that that's where the kind of place they're going to use to display what they've done. And it's poverty. The record talks about one of their captains who they nickname as Captain Poverty. And it's also religious change. Now, the Aslabys are gentry, and they are very much establishment, and they are very much those that will side with the winning side. And they are part and parcel of putting down this rebellion. If we go on, their son, Francis, who is the principal character, one of the principal characters in this, he was at the siege of Boulogne. And you can see here, I'll illustrate it, lots of pikemen, lots of guns and what have you. The siege of Boulogne costs Henry VIII an absolute fortune. It's one of the reasons for the revolt is that people are being taxed very highly. Henry VIII has debased the currency virtually to pay his debts because he thinks he's Henry V and he wants to take back parts of France. And it's a total illusion, especially since France has become much more united than when Henry V was about. So he's fighting a much more successful monarchy, a much more wealthy country. And he's doing it really, it boils down to ego. He's the only one who really wants to play the role of a past king, which is Henry V. So Francis Aslaby is at Boulogne. And at Boulogne, he is quite... he gets mentioned in dispatches, and to his credit. Now, wars with Scotland at this time are carrying on. Henry VIII wants his son Edward, who is then 7, to marry Mary Queen of Scots, who was then 5, and by doing so to unite the thrones of England and Scotland. That's the idea. It is termed the rough wooings, and certainly it is. History records Francis Aslaby at a war with the French at Boulogne, a time when the English cause was doomed because Henry's lost his ally. Charles V has already concluded a separate peace. Nevertheless, at Boulogne, Aslaby was applauded for his leadership of the light horse and chiefly for replacing lost horses. He was liberal to his men, especially to such as would venture their bodies to serve the king. So he's mentioned in dispatches in a very positive way. Later, Francis moves to Scotland, and he was at the Battle of Pinkie Cleugh. You can see at the top there are the English squares of pikemen, and out come the musketeers, fire off their muskets, and then go and hide behind the pikemen while they reload. The Scots are in the middle, and why, I do not know, the Scots got themselves trapped between the English fleet on one side and the English army on the other side. You can see the English fleet at the bottom of the illustration. 500 English dead, 15,000 Scots. It's a pretty grim battle. But after the battle, because Henry VIII has published the Bible in English, Bibles are distributed to the Scots. They are trying to say, come to us because we're now changing religion much more in your direction. You don't want to be with Mary Queen of Scots and her French mother. Try to win the hearts and minds over to Protestant England. Now, Aslaby has a commander, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, the father of Lady Jane Grey, and a convinced Protestant. Something's gone on. Oh, I see. Later, Henry was executed for opposing Mary Tudor's marriage to Philip of Spain. Grey would have problems with Aslaby, he certainly does. So, note where Dunbar is on the east, and Dalkeith is there, and the battle that's just been fought is Musselburgh Field, which is called Pinkie Cleugh, and of course the English are trying to take Edinburgh. But we see that what they're trying to do is not only militarily take Edinburgh or take Scotland, but they're trying also to keep the Protestant element in Scotland on their side. So they're trying to win hearts and minds. Well, anybody who knows about soldiers trying to win hearts and minds, I think we're looking around, we're all of a generation that thought the Americans tried to win hearts and minds in Vietnam. Not very successfully. This is Grey's report to Edward Seymour, the protector, the Lord Protector. Henry's just died, and the child, Edward VI, is now monarch, and his Lord Protector is Edward Seymour. Together with Dalkeith, Aslaby burnt down the neighbouring fisher villages to the utter ruin of that country. Grey added that for Francis Aslaby and his kind, pillage was their only service. Aslaby lacked the discipline and challenged the loyalty of those Scots who had sided with the English cause. Grey even suggested that it would be politic to compensate the local gentry for what Aslaby's forces had done. Now, pillage is common. Soldiers steal things. So to be in a report from a commanding officer back to government, you must have done things over the top. And so he does later. This is the Emperor Charles V's ambassador. A few months later, he's involved in the area around Dunbar this time, not Dalkeith. Captains Fisher and Aslaby, together with a German mercenary officer, had seemingly left not a single town or village intact around Dunbar. The three returned to camp, bringing with them a great booty of horned cattle, horses, mares, sheep, and excellent furniture. So it's stealing, all stealing. But it's surprising it's reported, because pillaging is a common feature in warfare. In the 100 Years' War, it was said there wasn't a woman in England who did not have a coat or a pot from France. It must have been excessive to have it reported. It must have been really over the top. So Wisdome is a contrast to this soldier. He is persecuted for his Protestantism. It starts early on. He's a Cambridge graduate. He's full of the new learning. He might have been a monk or a friar beforehand. Now he falls out with the authorities in Oxford and therefore moves on to Essex. And Essex is preaching. He has a great reputation for preaching. Archbishop Cranmer later on wanted him to be the Archbishop of Armagh because he wanted him a man capable of preaching to the Irish. His preaching earned a great envy, and people followed him. And they sent this Mr. Leswell to listen to what he preached. And Leswell brings a bile of a report upon my sermon. He's in trouble. Now, Essex was part of the Diocese of London, and London is the centre of early Protestantism. And the Bishop of London, Edmund Bonner, is very active in persecuting, arresting, trying to suppress early Protestantism. In 41, he's arrested and he came before Bonner. Bonner later would have a reputation for his zeal in burning Protestants. Wisdome was warned, "You are weak in complexion and lack strength to abide the punishment of imprisonment. And in case you should abide any danger of prison, yet the end will be, you shall either have a faggot and so run into perpetual infamy, or else be burnt." Now, again, a faggot might mean something like a branding, that kind of thing. Something that's going to stick forever, and you're not going to be able to preach in the way, or people will not want to look at you, or you won't attract people in to come and hear you, that kind of thing. It might mean just the milder thing of a public humiliation. But there's another phrase involved where his uncle warns him, "They may stuff your mouth so you may not be able to speak," which sounds like physical, some kind of physical branding, some kind of injury that they would inflict on him. And this is Bonner, as you can see, from Fox's Book of Martyrs. And you might not be able to quite see that. I'll try to increase the size. But he has a candle. And this guy is being burnt with the candle to repent. I must say, if somebody came up with a candle and was going to do that to me, I'd tell them whatever they wanted. And I think most of us would. This is Bonner again, another illustration from Fox's Book of Martyrs, beating a Protestant. Now, Wisdome disavows his heresy. He found the pressure intolerable. He says, "I was wrong. I've always preached what was wrong. Please release me." And he is released. Even so, he plucks up the courage again. And again, he's back in prison in 43. This time, he's visited by Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester. What's it called? The Cromwell series. Stephen Gardiner was acted by Mark Gatiss, who always likes to act creepy wrong ones, I think is what he says. And Bishop Stephen Gardiner is certainly a very clever man, an intellectual Catholic, but very wily. Gardiner made it clear that his life was in danger. And again, Wisdome agreed to recant and to sign a bill, a shameful bill that Winchester devised. In other words, he has to read this statement and he can't add to any of it, or he can't make any of it his own words. And he has to do it at St. Paul's Cross. Now, this is St. Paul's Cross, which is Old St. Paul's before the fire. And there is this outside pulpit, and a huge crowd could meet outside St. Paul's. And this is where he has to read out, "I've got it wrong, I'm sorry," all the rest of it, and recant his Protestantism. So that's where he has to do it. His books are burnt. He feels extremely guilty. He meekly confesses his frail and fearful weakness, whereby he, for fear of death, fell into impiety. And he goes on, and he desires to be forgiven by all good Christians. But again, a third time he's arrested, and this time into what's called the Lollard's Tower, which was used from the 14th century for heretics. Now, what does Wisdome believe? He certainly writes a lot in the Lollard's Tower. It must be costing him a fortune. Everything has to be paid for in prison. Prison's staff are not paid salaries. The prisoners pay the prison staff or the jailers with bribes. That's how they get their food, unless it's, of course, just the basic sort of gruel that the poorest prisoner might get. But Wisdome must be spending a fortune to keep himself in supply with writing materials. He says the new Pharisees rebuke the preachers by casting them into prisons. And this is what he wrote. They say, I would destroy all images, damn all ceremonies and organs, and that Christ shall at the day of judgment reward only of mercy and not our merits. In other words, I'm being accused of Calvinism. To this charge he countered that he didn't entirely believe in God's grace, and that Christians in any event should clothe themselves as an elect of God, a saint and beloved, with bowels of pity and kind hearts, gentleness and modesty. So he's saying that Calvinism may say you're predestined to go to heaven or to hell, but a Christian should be proving to himself that he is going to heaven by being piteous to the poor and being kind-hearted, and by gentleness and modesty. Yet he still defiantly says that he understands that it's God's grace alone that allows access to heaven. Calvin. So Wisdome is a Calvinist, like many, many Protestants will be, because it isn't the cosy Church of England that they first create. It is very much a low church, fearful of sin type of religion, believing that most will be damned. He did not believe in worshipping dead saints. He mocked the notion of purgatory. Now that mid-position between heaven and hell, purgatory where you're purged of your sins, that's where some people suggested that the source of ghosts was, that ghosts were the unquiet souls in purgatory. And he says they do not come again and pay boo peep with us. In other words, there is no purgatory, therefore there are no ghosts. Now that's a position Protestants won't be able to hold. That's not a position they will be able to hold, and they do say that the devil works with ghosts and all the rest of it later on. But the logic is that if for 1,000 years or 1,500 years the church has preached that ghosts are the unquiet souls from purgatory, it's therefore very difficult to believe in ghosts straight away when you're denying the idea of purgatory. Now he wants the scriptures to be open to all. Knowledge of the Bible, and he wanted to hear preaching. He's therefore something of a Puritan before the word is even invented. Again, he's released, and he retreats to Staffordshire, where he translates works of writing of Luther. But his activities again, in 46, he again becomes known for what he's doing. He might be in the wilds of the Peak District, but he's still known for his preaching. And he comes to the attention of the Crown for the 4th time. And in May of that year, 2 yeomen of the chamber were sent by the Privy Council to arrest him again. Now, we don't know what happened, because Henry VIII dies months later. And, of course, we get Edward VI. And Edward VI, of course, is very Protestant. And, therefore, Wisdome's fortunes are totally transformed. He gets Settrington. He became Rector of Settrington. A Rector of Settrington doesn't sound like a great job, but there are only 3 East Riding livings with any decent money behind them. Settrington, Kilham and Cottingham. It was also political. He's on 42 quid a year. Hans Holbein, the great artist, Henry VIII pays 30 quid a year. So you can see it is a very nice salary. Now, it was also political. It's about defending the North and the Protestant cause. This is Settrington, a very elaborate survey done in 1600. A very well-documented village, an extraordinary documented village. It's only got about 300 people. It had 300 people then, it's about that amount now. But it is extremely well documented because of these two. The Earl and Countess of Lennox, the parents of Henry Darnley, Mary Queen of Scots' second husband, they lived there. They're Catholics. So, of course, Edward VI Protector wants a Protestant rector in Settrington. He wants the Lennoxes watching. That's what he wants. And there's a whole paper produced for Northern History, maybe a bit longer ago, which is about intrigue from Settrington and how spies are sent out. So he's there to watch, but we won't get into the spies of Settrington because that's another talk. In December 53, he is in trouble again because, of course, Edward VI doesn't last for long, and Mary comes to the throne. And here, with the accession of Mary Tudor, he is barred from teaching and from saying Mass. And wisdom has to return to difficult times. Northern opinion is still very conservative. It's not very warm to Protestants. And it's not very warm to married Protestant clergy. As such as were of heretical opinions, where the bishops or priests, having wives, did nothing rejoice, but began to be ashamed of themselves, for the common people would point with fingers. By January 1554, men and women with convictions like Wisdome's began to go into exile. So bishops that weren't going to, some of the bishops obviously stay and are burnt later. There's about 400 burnings in the Marian period. But lots of people skip the country. And Gardiner is wily enough to think, we must get this regime settled first. We can't start persecuting straight away. And he almost gives a hint, I'd rather you people get left the country. And lots of them do leave the country. He's a married cleric. It's an anxious time. By February, an increasing numbers have already left for the Low Countries, Germany and Switzerland. So all his pals, all the people he went to university with that are Protestant, are on their way to the continent, escaping. Most of them have gone by February. In April, he's called before Doctors Rokeby and Dakins. Now, if it was me, Rokeby I wouldn't be too worried about. Dakins I would be fearful of. Dakins is responsible for the only burning in Yorkshire. The Snell brothers. Now, the north of it's a difficult one to explain, but in the Richmond area, there's a portion of the Richmond area which is in the Diocese of Cheshire. There are no burnings in the Diocese of York. But because this area is nearer York than it is Cheshire, the Bishop of Cheshire asked Dakins to go and sort out the Snell brothers. Now, the Snell brothers were Protestant, they were yeoman farmers, and Dakins tries to say to them, if you don't recant, we'll burn you. One of them recants, the other one doesn't, and in Richmond Marketplace, they burn him. And Dakins is definitely, he's the judge involved in that, in the Snell brothers. The other brother, in guilt, drowns himself in the Swale 3 days later. It's a total tragedy, and it's well documented. Now, he's in front of Rokeby has got a good reputation as a lawyer, just a straightforward guy who operates the law. Does so until Elizabeth's reign. Anyway, face to face with the Marian authorities, he stubbornly refuses to be separated from Margaret. The diocesan court had him back the following Tuesday. So he was there on the Friday and he's back on the Tuesday. Again, he refuses to divorce her. He will not divorce her. It is before the Marian burnings. They will begin a year later. It's persecution through the protracted legal process. It gave Wisdome time to be prudent, and he probably knew that. And he did not appear a third time. This is the time to go. This is the time to scuttle off. Instead, he and his wife hurried off to Frankfurt. Now, Frankfurt's a pretty strange place. Frankfurt is a free city within the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor is Charles V, who is an ardent Catholic, but he has to, because he's preoccupied with wars in Italy and he's occupied with wars with the Turks, he has to give a bit of slack to these German free cities because he's occupied elsewhere. And therefore he allows them to practice their religion, but he's told them, don't get involved in politics. So they cannot get involved. The émigrés that come to Frankfurt or to Strasbourg, they cannot get involved in politics. They can practice Protestantism, but they can't go any further than that. Now, how do you finance this? 42 quid a year, comfortable but not rich. He's not going to have any savings. That must have been spent on the time he was in prison. He knew that he would forfeit his benefits. And therefore, Wisdome is under pressure to make the best of his assets. There was one individual who might have some spare cash and was not fearful of authority. Whether Aslaby's capital came from pillage is unknown. Nevertheless, incongruous, this Catholic gentry family with a very bad reputation for being violent in the Scots War is now going to do a deal with this rather meek, sometimes brave, rector. They come to an agreement about a lease for the parsonage of Settrington on all the houses, glebe land, tithes, oblations, and other profits. Wisdome would have known that the rental for this lease would have gone to the Rector of Settrington, and he's not going to be the Rector of Settrington in a few months' time. It's going to be somebody else. The only way he could benefit was a payment for the leasehead, an entry fine, paid while Wisdome remained rector. And Aslaby says he paid Robert Wisdome a great sum of money to him beforehand. So to get hold of the lease, and that must have been, if you're doing a deal for land and property, if you're paying up front a big amount, then the rental the new Catholic rector's going to get is going to be smaller, isn't it? It's not going to be very much. Throws Settrington into flux. He's deprived his Wisdome in April. There's a new rector in May and a further one in September. Did these guys arrive and think that they'd got the parsonage and they've got this, that and the other and find out that they haven't? And that Aslaby has got it and they've got this, probably this legal dispute to get involved with if they want it back. Richard was rector to sometime in 55, and then he was succeeded by John Thornton. These two look to be related, but I can't prove it. It's John Thornton that brought matters before the Diocesan Chancery Court. In his deposition, Thornton details how he held the avowson and supported his appointment. Right, all this is above board. After which he says, and here he shows his feelings, for just that wisdom had been deprived for just causes and notorious offences committed against the laws of Holy Church, in other words, for being a married priest. And this is, of course, Thornton the Catholic, who was taking back Settrington from a Protestant rector. And you can see the anger in this document. This is quite extraordinary. If I was to write, well, anything about any historical character, and I think you would do the same, about anybody, you usually introduce them with their full name. You know, you might say John Dodsworth is speaking tonight. Dodsworth said this, and then you'd drop the John, wouldn't you, in the second, third, fourth time you'd abbreviate it. But the first time you would use the full name. Well, there's a gap here, and then there's the word wisdom clerk. You may be able to work that one out, the next two words. And the gap is the fact that the proctor, and it's in the draft copy, and this is the fine hand copy. The gap's there because the proctor who's taken this down thought, if this guy calms down, he might be courteous enough to let me add the name, but he doesn't. And what's more, when Aslaby refers to Thornton, he is equally discourteous, and again the proctor leaves a gap, which is interesting. Thornton obviously feels cheated and very, very aggrieved. We don't know the details of whatever he was there, how he lived. We know that it was all these clergymen in one little town. They really were writing so much, developing Protestantism. It was a hothouse, an academic hothouse, and they fall into two groups, as we shall see. They're highly disputatious. You know, they're the kind of guys who are going to stand up to authority, and they have done, and they're making sacrifices by coming to Frankfurt and places like Zurich as well. And they fall into two parties, which one of them was led by an acolyte of Thomas Cranmer, Richard Cox, and the other one by the Scot, John Knox. And historians love this. The Coxians and the Knoxians. Yeah, they fall into these two disputatious groups. If you've seen John Knox portrayed in any films, he is the most dour of individuals. Both believed in the authority of the Bible, in predestination, and through salvation through God's grace. They are all Calvinists. Their difference is their attitude to authority. Those who follow Cox believe in bishops and broadly accept the prayer book, whereas the Knoxians were thoroughgoing disciples of Calvin and rejected the notion of the church hierarchy and thought the prayer book a compromise with traditional belief. Now, of course, this is where the Church of Scotland is more Protestant perhaps than the Church of England is. And John Knox is the father of that church, without a shadow of a doubt. But the Knoxians and Coxians are, somebody wants to be radical. The Coxians want to be radical with religion and perhaps more conservative with authority and the established order. I've said that. Congregations that were self-governing elected their ministers and were led by church elders. In a way, Knoxians are more democratic, though they are priest-governed, than Coxians. And it has to be say that it is the Coxians that are the little snitches, because Knox writes papers that are political. And the Coxians say to the magistrates in Frankfurt, he's wandered into politics as this John Knox. You should be aware of this. You know, you might not have read this paper in English, but we'll translate it for you into German, and you'll see that he's not been that polite to Charles V. And that, of course, is whatever. It's just beyond the pale. So Knox has to leave. The Coxians manage to wheedle out the Knoxians and goes to Zurich. But meanwhile, back in England, and I put this, obviously, this in for this evening, Francis Aslaby came from the traditional gentry, self-interest first, as with the Seymour revolt, as with his behaviour in Scotland. He became the Member of Parliament for Scarborough, a member, because you had two, didn't you? You always had two members of Parliament. One of the members of Parliament for Scarborough in Mary's reign. Only in Mary's reign. There's one Parliament in Mary's reign. And Francis, I think you had 40 electors, something like that, the burgesses. And Francis gets one of the seats. He was loyal. He was loyal to Mary. He even expressed his loyalty about her marriage to Philip of Spain. Now, some Catholics were a little bit hesitant to bleat loyalty about that particular aspect, because you've got to imagine with this is the first time that you've really got a queen regnant, not a queen consort. They don't believe that this woman is going to run the place without Philip's involvement. However much she is called the regent and she is here and he's over there and he's far too busy with those other possessions to be involved, they believe that Spain is running the Marian regime. And she does have a lot of Spaniards in court, without a shadow of a doubt. So, there are two revolts, and one of them you may have heard of, because it affects Scarborough. But he's so loyal that at the end of his life, he gets the East Riding Manor of Broomfleet in reward for his loyalty. Now, whether that loyalty had any connection with Stafford's revolt, I do not know, but it does come after Stafford's revolt. Now, I don't know if you have you ever heard of Stafford's revolt? No. Okay. Stafford is a nobleman. He is related to the Yorkists. He thinks he's got a claim to the crown. He was involved in the first Wyatt's revolt against Mary when she first suggests the marriage to Philip. And he collects up a couple of Frenchmen, 2 or 3 Scots, rest are English, and they sail from the Low Countries in 3 ships and they land in Scarborough. Now, Dudley, who is a Protestant, thinks it's stupid. And he calls Stafford before he gets there. You're going to be King of Scarborough. That's all you're going to be. You know, that's what it's going to amount to. And he arrives in Scarborough and he takes the castle for 3 days. And then there are 30. He arrives with 30 men, the record says, and there are 32 executions. And which says that all of them, and they spread them around. Some of the executions are at Tyburn. There are polls ordered for heads in York at that time, which we presume are for some of the rebels, and at least one of them is executed at Hessel. So if you're a regime that wants to frighten people into obedience, which is Henry VIII's phrase, you spread the executions about, and you may even spread the bits about after that. That's how it goes. So, friend Aslaby finishes his career not only with Settrington, his relatives inherit Settrington, the lease, but he also gets this new manor in near the Humber, which to my mind looks very much like a reward for his loyalty. And as he's connected with Scarborough, though it's not recorded, I would suggest he might be involved in putting down the Stafford revolt. Now, of course, things change again, and we are coming to the end of this. It is a bit long. The accession of Elizabeth, all the emigres come back from Strasbourg, from Frankfurt, from Zurich, and of course they all are now in the tray of Elizabeth. They are very much supporters of the new monarch. Richard Cox becomes Bishop of Ely, and Wisdome his archdeacon. Good. John Thornton is deprived of Settrington, and Robert Wisdome is restored as rector of Settrington. On the list of rectors of Settrington in the parish church, it should have Wisdome twice over, but it doesn't. But never mind. But Wisdome is restored as rector, and he can justify it. You know, Puritans preach that there should be a preacher in every parish church, and pluralism, having two jobs, particularly jobs that are hundreds of miles apart, mean that you can't preach on a Sunday in two places, and pluralism is wrong. But Wisdome does have a reason to hold on to Settrington. The Lennoxes are still there, and of course Elizabeth comes to the throne in 58. Darnley's marriage to Mary Queen of Scots will not occur until 65, and for 6 years there are people going from places like Settrington or from Temple Newsome on occasions to the continent. And the idea that Mary Queen of Scots' marriage to Darnley is a love match is a load of nonsense. It's about a 6-year negotiation. And she's saying, well, I've got a better choice. I've got this Prince of Denmark or this French nobleman, which is much higher in the social batting order than you are, Darnley. And it's only later that she settles for Darnley. And it's much more a pragmatic political marriage than is first said. And you would want Wisdome back in Settrington if you were Elizabeth, because you would want somebody who had the right to appoint the correct curate, somebody who was talking to the bailiff, who would be telling you about anybody who was leaving. There's the Archbishop says the Lennoxes have fishing boats. The Lennoxes can get to the coast very quickly. It's only 12 miles. Well, it's not 12 miles. It's more than 12 miles. But in saying 12 miles, I think the Archbishop is anxious. He's saying it's very close, and these people can be up to no good. I've said that. They're 150 miles apart. Okay. So that's the politics. And just to complete, Wisdome has a contribution to worship. Before the Reformation, there's things called rood screens. Now, that might look very attractive, and you might think that's one of the attractions of Catholicism, that it's very, very much more aesthetically pleasing than plain Puritan churches. But of course, if the priest is conducting the Mass in the chancel, beyond the nave, beyond the congregation, and you can hardly hear him, and he may be the worst educated, what they used to call Sir John Lack Latin, those kind of priests who hardly know a few prayers, if he's that sort, then it's mumbling, and you are there to pray. You've got no part in the service, and it's all going on in a remote area of the church. With Protestantism, the altar comes forward for one of the rare occasions there are Holy Communion services, and of course everybody hears things. Listening, it's argued to be passive, behind the rood screen. Singing was restricted to the clergy and a choir. Now, Wisdome composes metrical psalms. The psalms put into verse form and sung to popular tunes were the first form of congregational singing, and Wisdome is one of these that writes them. It had great value. It educates. You know, we all know the hymns we sang at school. They are all in our brains if we care to retrieve them. You know, we can join in them in carols and things like that without really looking at the hymn book. And that was certainly the truth of the matter when the metrical psalm came in. And they were sung to tunes that the congregation knew. Wisdome was an exponent. He was, however, criticised for it. He wasn't the best. Arch-botcher of the psalm and prayer. And then there is this, that was in the prayer book until the end of the 18th century. Preserve us, Lord, by thy dear word from Turk and Pope. Defend us, Lord, which both would thrust out of his throne our Lord Jesus Christ, thy dear Son. Not really very advanced and liberal today. I have to say, if you look it up on the internet, there's American Christians who still sing this. And I guess you wouldn't take money, you wouldn't bet, would you, on which political grouping that kind of person supports. No. Wisdome had argued that the Bible should be discussed in the alehouse, and which Francis Beaumont said, filled with such moisture in most grievous qualms, did Robert Wisdome write his singing psalms. So, what we've got here in conclusion. Aslaby is a ruthless opportunist, Wisdome a Calvinist, an Elizabethan Puritan, an idealist willing to suffer for his beliefs, but not to the point of martyrdom, which is not unusual. Most people recanted. And I can't blame them. Severest critics were his poetry rather than his fear of the flames. Thank you.